Father, what is going on?
It's worse than we thought. The company is finished.
There is a particular kind of cruelty in being unseen by the people you are supposed to belong to. Not hatred. Not an open argument. Something quieter than that, and somehow worse. It is the cruelty of being looked at and decided upon in the same breath, of having someone glance at your face and conclude, without ever asking a single question, that there is nothing underneath it worth knowing. For 9 years, that was the life Claire Caldwell lived inside the family she had married into. They looked at her and saw a quiet woman, a plain woman, a woman who had married above herself and ought to be grateful for it. They did not know her. They never tried to. And because they never tried, not one of them noticed the truth that was sitting at their dinner table the entire time, smiling softly, saying very little. What none of the Caldwells understood, as they corrected her at meals and forgot her name at parties and spoke about her as if she were furniture in the room, was that the woman they had dismissed held more power than every person in that family combined. They did not know it on the morning the letter arrived. They did not know it as Robert Caldwell read the name of the company that intended to swallow everything his family had built and felt the floor tilt beneath him. They did not know it as the room went silent and every face turned pale. There was only one person at that table who was not afraid that morning. Only one person whose hands did not shake. And she was the very person they had spent 9 years teaching themselves not to see. This is the story of the day they finally did. Before we go any further, I want you to hold on to a single question, because everything that follows turns on it. How is it possible to live beside someone for nearly a decade, to share their table and their holidays and their roof, and never once learn who they truly are? The Caldwells would spend the rest of their lives asking themselves that. But on this particular morning, the question that mattered was far more immediate. A company called Ashford Global had set its sights on Caldwell Mills, the family business that had defined 3 generations, and it intended to take it. Robert Caldwell did not know who controlled Ashford Global. He did not know why a giant would bother with a small family mill in a forgotten corner of the country. And he certainly did not know that the answer was standing in his own kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee. There were 3 things the family could not yet understand, and I want to lay them out plainly, because the rest of this story is the slow and astonishing process of these 3 things coming into the light. The first was the question of who was truly behind Ashford Global, this quiet empire that had appeared at their door without warning. The second was why Claire, the woman they had welcomed in name but never in heart, had never once told the people she loved the truth about where she came from. And the third, the oldest and the most buried of them all, was the question of what had happened 30 years earlier, long before Claire ever met Mark, that bound these 2 families together by a thread none of them could yet see. The answers were coming. But first, something had to break. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the story you are about to hear is not the story the Caldwell family thought they were living. It is the story underneath that one, the true story, and it had been unfolding patiently for 30 years before any of them noticed. To understand how a quiet woman came to hold the fate of an entire family in her hands, we have to go back. Back before the letter. Back before the boardroom. Back in the day, a young man named Mark Caldwell walked into a small bookshop on a rainy afternoon and met a woman who would change everything, though he would not understand how much for almost a decade. Mark Caldwell was the kind of man who carried the weight of a family name without ever quite choosing to. He was the only son, the heir to Caldwell Mills, raised from boyhood to believe that the company and the family were the same thing, and that both rested on his shoulders. He was earnest, decent, a little tired in a way men who inherit obligations often are. And in the afternoon he met Claire. He was not looking for anything at all. She was standing in the back of a small bookshop, reading quietly, and when he asked her a clumsy question about a title on the shelf, she answered him with a warmth that made him forget what he had come in for. She did not ask what he did. She did not ask about his family. She simply talked to him as though he were a person, and not a name, and Mark had not felt that in a very long time. What struck him about Claire, in those early days, was how little she wanted from him. He was accustomed to people who circled the Caldwell name like it was something to be mined. Claire never mentioned it. When he told her, eventually, what his family did, she nodded politely and changed the subject, as though a textile mill were the least interesting thing about him. She did not speak much about her own past, and Mark, charmed and a little relieved, did not press. She mentioned a father she had loved and lost, a quiet upbringing, years spent moving from place to place. She spoke of these things gently and then let them go. Mark believed he was looking at a woman with a small and simple history. He did not yet know that some people keep their silences not because there is nothing to say, but because they are protecting something. When Mark brought Claire home to meet his parents, the verdict was reached before she had taken off her coat. Robert Caldwell, the patriarch, was a man who measured everyone by what they could offer the family, and he looked at Claire and saw nothing. No fortune. No connections. No name that meant anything in the circles he cared about. Margaret Caldwell, Mark's mother and the family's social gatekeeper, was colder still, in the polished way of women who have learned to wound without ever raising their voice. She smiled at Claire and called her dear and made certain, in 100 small ways, that Claire understood she had been weighed and found insufficient. Claire said nothing. She thanked them for dinner. She complimented Margaret's home. And she filed away, quietly, everything she observed, the way a person does when they have decided to learn who someone truly is. Mark married Claire despite his family, not because of them, and that decision was perhaps the bravest thing he ever did. Robert made his disappointment clear in the cool, deliberate way of a man who believes his son has thrown himself away. Margaret spoke of the wedding for years afterward as a thing she had endured rather than enjoyed. And from the very first day, Claire was placed in a particular position within the family, the position of the one who had married up, the one who ought to be grateful, the one whose opinions need not be sought because what could she possibly know? At gatherings, she was seated at the end of the table. In conversations about the business, she was spoken over. In family photographs, taken year after year, she stood slightly apart, half a step back, as though even the camera had absorbed the family's quiet verdict about where she belonged. And yet, if any of them had been paying attention, there were signs. Small ones, easily explained away, the kind of thing a family decides not to notice because noticing would require them to revise an opinion they had grown comfortable with. Claire read the financial pages every morning, slowly, with a concentration that did not match a woman who supposedly knew nothing of business. She recognized the names of executives at companies far beyond the Caldwell's modest world. Once, at a dinner, when a banker friend of Robert's misstated a fact about a major merger, Claire corrected him, quietly and precisely, and the table laughed, assuming she had simply repeated something she had overheard. She let them laugh. She had learned long ago that there was a strange and useful freedom in being underestimated. People say a great deal in front of those they believe cannot understand them. There was one object Claire kept that no one in the family ever asked about, and it would have told them everything if they had. On her side of the closet, behind a row of plain clothes, she kept a single framed photograph of an older man. He had kind eyes and a worn, gentle face, the face of a man who had worked hard and carried something heavy with grace. When Margaret noticed it once, in passing, she assumed it was some relative of no consequence, a grandfather perhaps, and never thought of it again. The man in the photograph was Edward Ashford. He was Claire's father. And he was, until his death 3 years before this story begins, the founder and sole architect of Ashford Global, one of the largest privately held conglomerates in the country. Claire was his only child. She was his only heir. And no one in the Caldwell family had the faintest idea. To understand why Claire kept her silence, you have to understand what she had watched her father carry for 30 years. Edward Ashford had not been born wealthy. He had built everything he owned from nothing, and he had built it after losing something first, something that left a quiet wound in him that never fully closed. Claire grew up watching her father succeed beyond any reasonable measure while carrying, beneath that success, an old and private grief he rarely spoke of. She learned early that money attracts people the way light attracts insects, and that almost no one who came near her father came near him for himself. By the time Claire was grown, she had developed a single, fierce, private wish. She wanted, just once in her life, to be loved by someone who had no idea what she was worth. And so she went looking, quietly, for an ordinary life. That is the thing the Caldwells never grasped, even after they learned the truth. Claire did not hide who she was in order to deceive them. She hid it because she was conducting the most important experiment of her life, an experiment in being valued for nothing but herself. When she met Mark and felt, for the first time, that a man wanted her company and not her name, she made a decision. She would keep her past to herself, not forever, but long enough to know for certain that what she had found was real. She would let the Caldwells show her exactly who they were when they believed she was no one. And so she watched. She watched how Robert spoke about people who could do nothing for him. She watched how Margaret treated those she considered beneath her. And year after year, the family answered the question Claire was asking, without ever knowing she had asked it. Meanwhile, the thing that would bring this story to its turning point was already in motion, and it had nothing to do with Claire at all. Caldwell Mills was dying. Robert Caldwell had built the company into the beating heart of its small town, the place where half the families in the area found their living, and for decades it had thrived. But the world had changed around it. The industry shifted overseas. Costs climbed. Orders thinned. Debt, which had once been a manageable shadow, grew into something Robert could no longer outrun. The proud old man refused to admit it, even to his own family. He cut quietly, borrowed quietly, and told himself that the next good year was always just ahead. Mark, who ran the day-to-day operations, knew better. He saw the numbers. He lay awake with them. But every time he tried to speak honestly to his father, Robert's pride closed the door. So Mark carried two burdens in silence. He carried a marriage his family had never accepted, and a company his family could not admit was failing, and he stood between them like a man holding two ropes that were slowly fraying in opposite directions. He loved his father. He loved his wife. He could not understand why the two could not simply make peace, and he had no idea, none at all, that the very thing destroying the mill and the very person his family had dismissed were about to collide in a way that would rewrite the entire history of both families. He thought the worst thing that could happen was that the mill would quietly close and his father's heart would quietly break, did not yet know that something far larger was already moving toward them, and that it carried, hidden inside it, the truth he had lived beside for 9 years. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning. It came in a heavy envelope, the kind that signals before it is even opened that the matter inside is serious. Robert opened it at the breakfast table, with the family gathered, and as he read, the color drained from his face. The letter was a formal expression of interest. A company called Ashford Global wished to acquire Caldwell Mills. The terms, on paper, were generous, far more generous than the failing mill could have hoped for in an honest sale. But Robert did not read it as an offer. He read it as a threat, the opening move of a giant that intended to take what his family had built and erase the name above the door. He set the letter down with a hand that trembled, and he said the name aloud, Ashford Global, and the room went silent. Everyone, that is, except Claire. Claire sat very still. She did not gasp. She did not ask questions. She set down her coffee, folded her hands, and looked at the letter on the table with an expression no one in the family bothered to read, because no one in the family ever bothered to read her. Had they looked, they might have seen something they had never seen on her face before, something that was not fear at all but a kind of quiet, sorrowful recognition, the look of a person watching a thing they had hoped to avoid arrive anyway. But they did not look. Robert was already declaring that he would never sell, that no faceless corporation would take what his father had built, and Margaret was already lamenting the indignity of it, and Mark was already running the grim arithmetic in his head. And Claire, the only one who understood what was truly happening, said nothing at all. In the days that followed, Ashford Global's interest did not fade. It sharpened. The generous letter was followed by a firmer one, and then by the quiet, relentless pressure that large companies know how to apply to small ones. Robert refused every overture, but with each refusal, the family's position grew weaker, because the truth Robert had hidden for years was beginning to surface. The bank grew nervous. Suppliers asked questions. The town began to whisper. And the family, under pressure, did what struggling families so often do. They turned on one another. Robert blamed the market and the times. Margaret blamed Mark's management. Mark, caught between them, blamed himself in the quiet way he blamed himself for everything. The old fractures in the family, the ones that pride had papered over for years, opened wide. And through all of it, Claire remained calm, and the family read her calm as the simple ignorance of a woman who did not understand the danger. That was the cruelest irony of those weeks, and the most telling. The one person in the house who understood the danger completely, who knew precisely who Ashford Global was and exactly what it was capable of, was the one person the family was certain understood nothing. They spoke freely in front of her. They strategized as though she were not there. Robert, in his frustration, once gestured at her and remarked that at least Claire had the sense not to pretend she understood the business, and Claire only smiled and refilled his water glass. She was still watching them. Even now, at the edge of catastrophe, she was watching to see who they truly were when they were afraid. And what she saw confirmed everything she had spent 9 years learning. Fear did not make them kinder. It made them smaller. It revealed, in sharp relief, exactly how little room they had ever made for her. As the pressure mounted, the family went looking for a villain, the way frightened people do, and they found one close to home. There was a rival businessman in town, a man named Harold Crane who had long competed with the Caldwells and who had made no secret of his ambitions. When word spread that Ashford Global seemed to know a great deal about Caldwell Mill's internal weaknesses, Robert became convinced that Crane was feeding information to the giant, betraying them for a piece of the spoils. The family seized on this theory with the desperate energy of people who need an enemy they can actually see. They investigated Crane. They confronted him. They poured weeks of their dwindling energy into a feud with a man who, as it turned out, had nothing whatsoever to do with any of it. The real source of Ashford Global's knowledge was sitting in their own home, and it was not betrayal. It was simply that Claire knew her own company. The first true crack in Claire's silence came late one evening, and it was Mark who witnessed it, though he did not understand what he had seen. He came home to find Claire on the phone behind the closed door of their bedroom, and through the door he caught only fragments, a tone in her voice he had never heard before, low and certain and entirely in command, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. And then, just before she ended the call, he heard a single word that did not fit anything he knew about his wife. He heard her say the word father. Mark stood in the hallway, confused. Claire's father had died 3 years earlier. She had told him so herself, gently, on one of their first evenings together. And yet here she was, speaking that word into a telephone in a voice he did not recognize. He told himself he had misheard. He went to bed. He said nothing. But the small wrong note stayed with him. Then came the envelopes. They began arriving at the house addressed not to Claire Caldwell but to a name the family had never seen, C. Ashford. The first one, Robert dismissed as a misdelivery and threw away without a second thought. More came. Claire collected them quietly, before anyone could look too closely, and the family, consumed by their war with Harold Crane and their fear of the giant at the gate, never stopped to wonder. Had Robert opened even one of those envelopes, he would have learned the truth a full week before it walked into his boardroom and looked him in the eye. He would have seen the Ashford Global letterhead. He would have seen his daughter-in-law's true name printed beneath it. But Robert Caldwell had spent his whole life refusing to look closely at things he had already decided about, and Claire, he had decided about long ago. So the envelopes piled up, unread, and the clock ran down. At last, Ashford Global delivered its final message. It requested a single meeting, a face-to-face conversation before the company moved to take Caldwell Mills by force. The family treated this summons as a declaration of war. They scraped together the money to hire a lawyer they could barely afford, a serious man with a serious briefcase, and they prepared as though they were marching into battle. They studied Ashford Global. They tried to learn everything they could about the enemy. And the more they learned, the stranger the picture became. Ashford Global was vast, far vaster than any of them had imagined, with holdings across a dozen industries and a reach that touched lives all over the country. It had been founded by a man named Edward Ashford, now deceased, who had built it from nothing in a single generation. And it was now controlled, the family read, by a single private heir who had never given an interview, never appeared in public, never been photographed. The family puzzled over this unseen heir. Who was this person who held so much and revealed so little? They imagined a recluse, a hardened mogul, some cold and calculating figure who took small companies apart for sport. They never once imagined the truth, because the truth was too close, too quiet, too thoroughly dismissed. And here was Claire, asking, in her gentle way, whether she might come along to the meeting, just to offer Mark her support. Robert nearly told her to stay home. Margaret made a small remark about the meeting being no place for someone who would only be confused by it. But Mark, exhausted and grateful for any comfort, said yes, his wife could come. And so it was decided. Claire would be in the room. The unseen heir of Ashford Global and the Caldwell family would finally meet face to face, and only one person in that room knew that those two things were the same. The night before the meeting, the house was quiet with dread. Robert sat alone with his pride and his fear. Margaret moved through the room straightening things that did not need straightening. And Mark lay awake beside Claire, staring at the ceiling, certain that tomorrow a stranger would walk into a boardroom and decide the fate of everything his family had ever built. It was then that Claire turned to him in the dark and said something he would not understand until the following afternoon, something he would replay for the rest of his life. She took his hand and she told him, quietly, that whatever happened tomorrow, she needed him to remember one thing. She needed him to remember that she had married him. Not his name. Not his father's mill. Him. Mark squeezed her hand and told her he knew, and he did not understand at all, and Claire let him not understand, because tomorrow would explain everything. The Caldwells arrived at the meeting braced for a stranger. They sat on one side of a long table, the family and their nervous lawyer, and they waited for the representative of Ashford Global to appear and pronounce their fate. Robert had rehearsed his defiance. Mark had prepared the numbers. Margaret had arranged her face into something composed. And Claire sat among them, quiet as ever, her hands folded in her lap, and no one paid her any mind. Then the door opened. And the family turned, expecting to see a stranger walk in. But no stranger came. Instead, after a moment, Claire rose from her seat beside her husband. She walked, calmly and without hurry, to the head of the table, to the chair that had been left empty for the controlling owner of Ashford Global. And she sat down in it. And she looked at the family she had lived among for 9 years, and she let the silence stretch. No one spoke. No one could. Robert's mind refused, at first, to accept what his eyes were telling him. Margaret's composed face came apart. Mark stared at his wife, at the woman he had slept beside for 9 years, sitting now at the head of a table she commanded with nothing but her presence, and he felt the entire shape of his life shift beneath him. The lawyer they had hired looked from Claire to the family and back, and slowly understood that he had been brought to defend them against a power that had been sleeping in their own home. And still Claire said nothing for a long moment. She did not gloat. There was no triumph in her face, no cruelty, none of the things a person might expect from someone finally holding power over those who had dismissed her. There was only a deep and quiet stillness, the stillness of a woman who had carried something heavy for a very long time and was about to, at last, set it down. When Claire finally spoke, her voice was gentle, the same gentle voice that had thanked Margaret for dinner 9 years earlier and complimented her home. She introduced herself, properly, for the first time. She told them that her name was Claire Ashford, that she was the only child and sole heir of Edward Ashford, and that she controlled the company that now sat across the table from them. She watched the words land. She watched Robert grip the edge of the table. And then she told them the part that mattered most to her, the part she had waited 9 years to say. She had not hidden who she was to deceive them. She had hidden it because, just once in her life, she had wanted to be loved by people who did not know what she was worth. She had wanted to know if a family would make room for her when they believed she was no one. And now, she said softly, she had her answer. The reckoning that followed was not loud. Claire did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply spoke the truth, plainly, of the 9 years she had lived among them. She reminded them, without anger, of the seat at the end of the table, of the name forgotten at parties, of the conversations she had been spoken over, of the photographs in which she stood half a step apart. She did not accuse. She recounted. And as she did, each member of the family was forced to see, reflected back in her quiet words, exactly who they had been when they believed no one important was watching. Robert, who had measured her worth and found nothing, was confronted with the fact that the nothing he had dismissed had held his fate in her hands all along. Margaret could not meet her eyes. And Mark, the husband, sat with the slow and shattering understanding of who his wife had been the whole time. But it was Mark's understanding that cut both ways, and Claire knew it would. Because as the truth settled over the room, a darker possibility settled over Mark. He had married a woman he believed to be ordinary, and now he learned she was one of the wealthiest people in the country. And the question rose in him, unbidden and terrible. Has any of it been real? Had she chosen him, or had she been studying him too, the way she had studied his family? Claire saw the question form on his face, and it was the only moment in that entire room when her composure wavered, because this was the one verdict she truly feared. She turned to him, and she reminded him, gently, of what she had told him in the dark the night before. She had married him. Not his name. Not his father's mill. Him. And she had kept her secret precisely because she needed to know that he had done the same. Then Robert, his pride in ruins, asked the only question left that he did not understand. Why? Why had Ashford Global, of all the companies in the world, come for Caldwell Mills? It was a small mill in a small town. It was failing. It was beneath the notice of a giant. There was no business reason for any of this. And here Claire's expression changed again, into something older and sadder than anything that had come before. She reached into a folder before her and drew out a single object, a faded photograph, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. She slid it across the long table toward Robert. It was a photograph of 2 young men, standing outside a mill, shaking hands. One of them was unmistakably a young Robert Caldwell. And the other, Robert realized, as the blood left his face entirely, was a man he had spent 30 years trying not to remember. The man in the photograph beside the young Robert Caldwell was Edward Ashford. And Robert knew him. Robert knew him very well. Because 30 years before any of this, before there was an Ashford Global, before Claire was even born, Robert Caldwell and Edward Ashford had been partners. They had founded the original mill together, 2 young men with nothing but ambition and a handshake, equals in every way that mattered. For a few years, they had built something real, side by side. And then a downturn had come, a hard season that frightened Robert badly, and in his fear Robert had done the thing that would define the rest of both their lives. He had maneuvered his partner out. He had used the fine print and the timing and Edward's trust against him, and he had bought Edward's share of the company for almost nothing, certain that Edward, without him, would amount to nothing at all. Edward Ashford had walked away with little more than the clothes he wore and a young family to feed. He had said nothing. He had not sued, had not fought, had not spread word of what Robert had done. He had simply gone, and Robert, having taken what he wanted, had told himself a comfortable story, the story that Edward had not really been essential, that the success which followed was Robert's alone. He had not allowed himself to wonder what became of the man he pushed out. If he had wondered, he might have been astonished. Because Edward Ashford, with nothing, had begun again. Quietly, patiently, without bitterness, he had built a new venture, and then another, and then a dozen more, and over 30 years he had assembled one of the great fortunes in the country, an empire that dwarfed everything Robert Caldwell had ever owned. And he had done it all while carrying that one old wound, the wound of a friend's betrayal, that never fully healed. Claire had grown up inside that quiet wound. She had watched her father succeed beyond all measure and still carry, in his gentlest moments, the grief of having once trusted a man who took everything and called it his own. Edward never spoke Robert's name with hatred. That was the thing Claire remembered most. He spoke of him, on the rare occasions he spoke of him at all, with a kind of sorrow, the sorrow of a man who had lost not just a business but a friend, and who had never understood how the friend could have done it. And in his final years, as his health failed, Edward had said something to his daughter that she had carried ever since. He told her that if the chance ever came, she should not use what he had built to take revenge. He told her that he had spent 30 years refusing to let what Robert did to him turn into bitterness, and he did not want it to turn into bitterness now, after he was gone. And so Claire revealed, in that silent boardroom, the final truth, the one that turned the entire story on its head. Ashford Global had not come to destroy Caldwell Mills. It had come to save it. When Claire, years into her marriage, had quietly looked into the failing finances of the family she had married into, she had recognized at once that the mill was sliding toward collapse, that Robert's pride would let it die before he admitted the truth, that the town built around it would lose everything. And she had remembered her father's words. So she had moved, carefully and in secret, to bring the mill under Ashford Global's protection, not to take the Caldwell name down but to keep it standing, to save the jobs of the families in that town, to do for Robert Caldwell the very thing Robert had once refused to do for Edward Ashford. She had come not to settle a score. She had come to honor a wish. The terms she laid out were not the terms of conquest. They were the terms of rescue. Ashford Global would absorb the mill's debt. It would secure the jobs. It would invest in the equipment and the future that Robert could no longer afford. And the name above the door, the name Caldwell, would stay exactly where it was. Robert Caldwell would keep his dignity, the one thing he had taken from Edward all those years ago, and it would be given back to him by the daughter of the man he had wronged. The old man sat with the photograph in his trembling hands and wept, and they were not the tears of a man who had lost, but the far more difficult tears of a man confronted, all at once, with the full weight of what he had done and the impossible grace of being forgiven for it by someone who owed him nothing at all. For Mark, the resolution was its own kind of reckoning. He came to understand that the woman he had loved had been, all along, exactly who he believed her to be, gentle and good and worth far more than his family had ever allowed. The fortune changed nothing about that. If anything, it confirmed it, because a woman who could have crushed his family at any moment had instead spent 9 years quietly loving him and waiting, patiently, to learn whether he loved her back for the right reasons. He stood in that boardroom, and he went to her, and in front of his stunned family he took her hand, and he chose her openly, the way she had always deserved to be chosen. Margaret, who had spent 9 years making Claire understand her place, was left to sit with the knowledge that the place Claire had occupied the entire time was higher than her own. In the months that followed, the mill did not close. It was saved, exactly as Claire had promised, and the town that depended on it never knew how close it had come to losing everything. The Caldwell name stayed above the door. And the family that had once seated Claire at the end of the table found themselves rearranged around her, not by force, but by the simple gravity of who she had always been. Robert, in his final years, became a quieter and a humbler man, and he and Claire reached something that was not quite friendship but was more than peace, an understanding between the daughter of the man he had wronged and the man himself, built on a forgiveness he knew he had not earned. He kept the faded photograph on his desk until the day he died. He looked at it often. And he was never again able to look at anyone, anywhere, and decide they were no one. So what is the truth this story leaves us with, after all the secrets have come into the light? It is not a story about money, though money runs all through it. It is not even, in the end, a story about revenge, because the most powerful person in it chose, deliberately, not to take any. It is a story about being seen, and the terrible cost of refusing to see one another. For 9 years, an entire family looked at a quiet woman and decided there was nothing underneath. They were wrong in the largest way it is possible to be wrong. And the question that should stay with us, long after the mill is saved and the name is kept, is a question about ourselves. How many quiet people have we glanced at and decided about? How many times have we mistaken silence for emptiness and missed, entirely, the depth that was sitting right beside us the whole time? I want to leave that question with you, because it is the real heart of everything you have just heard. If you had been Claire, after 9 years of being overlooked by the very people you tried to love, would you have chosen what she chose? Would you have answered cruelty with rescue, and betrayal with grace? Or would you have walked away and let them fall? There is no easy answer, and I would truly love to hear yours. Tell me in the comments where you land, because stories like this one only mean something when we wrestle with them together. And be honest with yourself about one more thing. If you had been sitting at that table, watching that quiet woman read the financial pages and correct the banker and keep that photograph hidden in her closet, would you have noticed the truth? Or would you, like the Caldwells, have decided there was nothing there to see? If this story moved you, then stay close, because the one I am preparing to tell you next may move you even more. It is the story of a housekeeper who spent 15 years serving a grand old family in their sprawling estate, enduring every slight and every order without complaint, until the day the will was read and the family learned, to their absolute astonishment, that the house they had ordered her around in for 15 years had belonged to her the entire time. You will not believe how that one ends. So subscribe, and stay with me, for more true stories of the people the world looked at and underestimated, and the unforgettable day that everyone, at last, found out exactly who they had been standing next to all along.